Hi, I am Tarindu. I am a student of Sri Lanka Institute of Information Technology Malibe campus in Sri Lanka. This is our second tutorial related to Microsoft SharePoint. I think you remember our first tutorial was uploaded early. Those old tutorials we did for PLDC project. I am not going to introduce our group members. Those are they. This is progress of our tutorial. Our session 1 part was did in last tutorial. It consists of some information, details and benefits about Microsoft SharePoint. We think you all saw that early. Now we are going to do our session 2 part using Microsoft SharePoint. It is practical session. Now we move to our practical session. I invite Mr. Ted Asen to do this practical.
Hi, I'm Ted Pattison. I'd like to welcome you to the Office Developer Screencast Virtual Tour. In this video tutorial, we're going to talk about building ASP.NET Web Parts for Windows SharePoint Services 3.0. I'm going to start by building a Windows SharePoint Services 3.0 site so that we have a place to test and debug our web part. Next, I'm going to use Visual Studio to build an ASP.NET Web part. We're going to then deploy that in SharePoint by compiling it to the bin directory for the web application and adding an entry for a safe control into the web.config file. Finally, we're going to go to a SharePoint site and we're going to modify the web part gallery so that we can then take our web part and add it to a page for testing and debugging. Okay, we're going to begin step 1 by creating a new Windows SharePoint Services 3.0 site. The way that we do that is by going to the Administrative Tools group and finding the SharePoint 3.0 Central Administration web application. This application allows us to do administrative procedures, such as in this case where we want to create a new site collection. So I clicked on the Application Management tab, and if I go down to the section which is SharePoint Site Management, the very top administrative link is Create Site Collection. So I click on that, it brings me to a page that's going to allow me to type in the information about this new site collection. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put in a title. There's no need for a description. The second thing I do is I give it some information so it can start creating the URL where it's going to provision this site. So you can see right here that it's going to provision the site at HTTP litware server sites dev site. Now the next thing I have to care about as I start creating this new site is coming up with a user account that's going to be the owner. And so in this case right here, since I'm logged onto this box as the domain administrator, I'm just going to go ahead and make that account as the site owner. Finally, I'm going to pick a site template. Since I'm just doing some basic development work, I'm going to create a very bland site, so I'm going to use blank site as the site template. I went ahead and clicked OK, and now SharePoint is moving through the provisioning process. So it created some entries in the configuration database, some entries in a content database to provision this new site. It provides me a link, and so now I can click on this link and track down and see the new site that was just created. So it's a little bit vanilla, it's kind of plain, but it can provide a foundation for us doing our development and testing of web parts. Notice if I go down here and click on Site Actions and click Edit Page, well, I can get to a web part zone. But what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to leave this behind for a second, go into Visual Studio, and create a new custom web part DLL so that we'll have a web part to put inside this zone. So let's go ahead and fire up Visual Studio. And as I start Visual Studio, I'm going to go to the File menu and I'm going to choose New Project. And I'm going to pick a generic C# class library project. And since we're working for the Litware Corporation, we'll just go ahead and name the project Litware, so we're going to build litware.dll. Now, if you've done web part development for Windows SharePoint Services v2, you probably know that the SharePoint team created a project template for you to give you a starting point for a web part DLL project. That will be something that the SharePoint team does for you in an SDK by the time Windows SharePoint Services 3.0 is released. But in the beta cycle, there is not one of those project templates, so you're going to have to create the project from scratch, which is going to be better for your understanding anyway. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to the project references, and I'm going to choose Add Reference. And I'm going to add a reference to the ASP.NET DLL, system.web.dll. Once I've added a reference to system.web.dll, I can get at the ASP.NET classes that I'm going to need to create the new web part. So I'll say using, and I'll say system.web, and I'm going to import a couple different namespaces. The next one I'm going to import is system.web.ui. The next one I'm going to import is system.web.ui.webcontrols. And let's just do one more, system.web.ui.webcontrols.webparts. And that's going to hold the base class that we're going to inherit from. So let's create a simple class in here. And I'm going to go down and rename this class and the class file to hello and hello.cs. Once I've done that, now we're going to go ahead and we're going to have this class inherit from a built-in class in the ASP.NET programming model called WebPart. The ASP WebPart class was introduced in ASP 2.0 along with the other WebPart infrastructure features. And to get Hello World functionality, there's one method that I'm going to override named renderContents. Now, when I implement renderContents, notice that they pass me a single parameter named writer, which is of type HTML text writer, which is a common ASP.NET programming type. And one of the things it allows me to do is to write a simple message back to the user. So I'll say hi, and then I'll go ahead and include the name of the user so I can demonstrate the fact that when you program inside of a web part, you're really inside of a standard ASP.NET control. So in ASP.NET programming, when you write code behind a page, when you write code behind a server-side control, you can always get to the context object that provides a pretty nice API, including a property called user, and I can say user.identity.name, and so I can greet the user, and I can greet the user by whatever account name they're logged in as. Okay, so really this is the basic code to do an Hello World web part. Now before I compile the web part, I have to consider where the web part is going to be deployed. One option would be for me to change this DLL and to build it with a strong name so then I could compile it and install it in the global assembly cache. That's something that might be common in production. I'm not going to do that here. I'm going to use a simpler technique. An alternative way to deploy a web part DLL is to put it in the bin directory for the hosting IIS web application. And if I want to do that, I'm going to go to my project. I'm going to right-click on the project and choose Properties. And I'm going to go to the Build tab.